The lymphatic system is a network of vessels that contain a lymph fluid, as well as organs like lymph nodes and the spleen that contain a high density of white blood cells. So the lymphatic system has two major functions that we'll talk about. One is the recovery of fluid in the interstitial fluid. So it turns out that more water is filtered out of capillaries than gets reabsorbed, and this 15% or so of the water that's filtered but not reabsorbed is taken up by lymph capillaries, where it becomes lymph, and then it flows with the lymph into the subclavian veins of the systemic circuit and becomes plasma. A second major function is that white blood cells live in lymph organs like the lymph nodes, and they will attack and destroy pathogens like bacteria that come into lymph capillaries and flow with the lymph into lymph nodes. They'll also destroy any foreign chemicals that flow with the lymph through lymph nodes. There are several components of the lymphatic system. The system itself begins with blind-ended lymphatic capillaries. And the interstitial fluid, when it flows from the interstitial fluid into lymph capillaries, is then inside lymph capillaries, known as lymph. The lymphatic vessels that come off the lymph capillaries are similar to veins and contain one-way valves. All of the lymph ultimately drains into the subclavian veins of the systemic circuit. So we're going to find there's two major lymph vessels. One's called the right lymphatic duct that drains lymph into the right subclavian vein, where the lymph, once in the vein, becomes plasma, and the thoracic duct, which empties lymph into the left subclavian vein. The lymphatic system, like veins, is a very low pressure system with pressures less than 5 millimeters of mercury. As a result, the lymph fluid in lymph vessels moves very, very slowly, and that movement is aided or controlled by the presence of one-way valves. So lymph always moves from one valve section to another on its way back to the subclavian veins. You've also got the skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump that aid in the movement of lymph in the same way they aid in the movement of blood in the venous system. So along the length of lymph vessels are swellings known as lymph nodes, and these lymph nodes are literally filled with a dense concentration of white blood cells, to include lymphocytes, both B and T lymphocytes, neutrophils, and macrophages. There are around 500 to 600 lymph nodes throughout the body, so they're numerous, and pathogens like bacteria can move into lymph capillaries and then flow with the lymph into a lymph node, where they would be attacked and destroyed by white blood cells living in the lymph nodes. So I've got a couple illustrations here that show the lymphatic system. So this would be a distribution of lymph vessels, and the swellings that you see along the vessel walls would be lymph nodes. And the lymph vessels are distributed throughout the body. Lymph capillaries are blind-ended, and the lymph system begins with the lymph capillaries. And these lymph capillaries are intermixed or intertwined with blood capillaries, so that interstitial fluid leaving blood capillaries that's not reabsorb, would flow into the lymph capillaries, become lymph, and then the lymph would eventually flow through lymph vessels back to the subclavian veins, where the lymph then would be plasma. This one shows the right lymphatic duct emptying lymph into the right subclavian vein, and the over here just shows it bigger. This would be the thoracic duct, which is a lymph vessel emptying lymph ultimately into the left subclavian vein. So before I leave the lymphatic system, let me just mention something about metastasis. Metastasis of cancer cells. So when cancer occurs, it begins with the transformation of a normal cell to a cancerous cell. And that cancerous cell then will divide by mitosis to form a cluster or group of cells known as a tumor. The primary tumor is the original tumor. It's the first one to form. And cancers are named after the site of the primary tumor. So if the primary tumor forms in the breast, you have breast cancer. If the primary tumor forms in the lungs, you have lung cancer. Metastasis can lead to the formation of what are called secondary tumors. So metastasis is the process by which cancer cells spread away from the primary tumor to other organs within the body to establish what are known as secondary tumors. So cancer cells can detach from the primary tumor and then move through openings in lymph capillaries into lymph capillaries and flow with the lymph along lymph vessels into the subclavian veins, where they then would be in the systemic circuit. And the cancer cells then can be distributed by the blood throughout the body. Cancer cells are capable, like white cells, of squeezing through openings in blood capillaries into the organs of the body, where a cancer cell that is detached from the original tumor is spread by way of the lymph to the blood vascular system, and in some distant organ from the original or primary tumor, it can start to divide by mitosis and establish what's called a secondary tumor. This can repeat itself, so you can end up having a number of secondary tumors over time throughout the body. So this would be the cluster of cells that make up the primary cancerous tumor, and a cancer cell would break away from the primary tumor and enter into lymph capillaries, and from there to lymph vessels, and from lymph vessels to the subclavian veins. And now the cancer cell is in the blood vascular system, and the blood distributes the cancer cell throughout the body. The cancer cell then would move out through blood capillaries into an organ of the body, where the cancer cells would divide by mitosis to establish what are known as secondary tumors.